What's the creepiest thing you found out about someone after looking them up online? In 2 years, my boss, Mr. Roach, had hired 7 guys who could have been brothers, all between 22 and 23, and all with that same specific look. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a pattern. The day after another of them was hired, I decided to look deeply into it. I found the obituary on page 3 of my search results. Gavin Roach, age 22, died in a hiking accident 4 years ago. The photo showed a young man with sandy brown hair, glasses, that same nervous smile. Mr. Roach's dead son looked exactly like every young man he'd hired. Over the next few weeks, I watched Mr. Roach with Jacob, the newest hire. He'd find excuses to walk by Jacob's desk, offered him rides home every day. Once I caught him just standing in Jacob's empty cubicle, touching the jacket on the chair. Jacob lasted 3 months before giving notice. He told me Mr. Roach had become too intense, calling him at home, showing up at his gym. Once he'd knocked on Jacob's apartment door at midnight, drunk, calling him Gavin. He kept asking if I forgave him, crying about some hiking trip, and it was terrifying. The day after Jacob left, Mr. Roach posted a new job opening, same requirements as always. I decided to confront him during lunch when the floor was empty. Mr. Roach, I know about Gavin. He froze. When he looked up, his eyes were hollow. They're nothing like him, he said quietly. I realized that eventually, so I let them go and try again. He opened his desk drawer, revealing photos of all the young men mixed with Gavin's, his hiking boots, a Father's Day card. We were supposed to go together that day. I canceled for a client meeting. He went alone and fell. 2 weeks later, I found myself looking into grief counseling. I planned to suggest it to Mr. Roach when Dean, the newest lookalike hire, stopped by my desk looking extremely troubled. Can I ask you something weird? Mr. Roach keeps mentioning this hiking trail, Eagles Peak. He says his son loved it, but when I looked it up, the trail's been closed since 2017. Gavin was in my college. He died in 2018. My stomach dropped. Are you sure? Yeah, no one's been allowed up there in years. I spent that night researching. Dean was right. Eagles Peak had been closed long before Gavin's death. The accident report listed the location as Miller's Trail, 20 miles away. Why would Mr. Roach lie about where his son died? I dug deeper into news archives. Found a small article about Gavin's death that mentioned a detail the obituary hadn't. Gavin's body was found with head trauma inconsistent with a fall. The next morning, I arrived early and snuck into Mr. Roach's office. I started going through it, and in a locked drawer, I found Gavin's actual hiking gear. The boots he'd supposedly worn that day were too clean for someone who'd been hiking. Even worse, there was something dark on the collar of the jacket, old blood. Just as I thought it couldn't get more weird, under everything was a life insurance policy. Gavin had been worth $2 million. The beneficiary was Mr. Roach's failing business. I heard footsteps and quickly closed the drawer and hid behind a curtain. Mr. Roach entered with Dean, who was carrying coffee and chatting about weekend plans. Mr. Roach watched him with that same intense stare, but now I saw it differently. Not grief, guilt. That night, Dean texted me. Mr. H asked me to go hiking with him this weekend. Says he wants to show me Gavin's favorite trail. Should I be worried? My blood went cold. I called Dean immediately. Don't go. Whatever you do, don't go. But even though he asked for my advice, Dean for some reason laughed it off. He said I was being paranoid. That Mr. Roach was just a sad old man missing his son. What harm could there be in one hike? Saturday morning, I drove to the real place Gavin died. I knew Mr. Roach would bring Dean here, not to Eagles Peak. I called the police on the way, but wasn't sure they'd believe me. I hiked up the trail, heart pounding. At the overlook, I found them. Mr. Roach and Dean standing close to the edge. Too close. Mr. Roach had his hand on Dean's shoulder, positioning him exactly where Gavin must have stood. You're just like him, Mr. Roach was saying. Same height, same build. If you fell from here, it would be the same outcome. Dean tried to step back, but Mr. Roach's grip tightened. Gavin figured it out, the life insurance, the debts. He was going to tell his mother. I couldn't let the business fail. Mr. Roach, let's go back, Dean said, voice shaking. I see him every night, standing right here, asking why. I hire boys like him hoping one will forgive me, but they never do. Because they're not him. I stepped out from the trees. Let him go. Mr. Roach shot around, taken aback I was here. The police are on their way, I yelled at him. But instead of the fear I expected, I saw a sad smile creep up on his face. That doesn't bother me. I've been living in hell for 4 years. He looked at Dean, then lightly shoved him towards the edge and took a step backwards. I'll never forget the sound that came from the bottom of the cliff next. Dean stumbled backward from the edge and dropped to his knees in the dirt. I stood there staring at the spot where Mr. Roach had been standing 2 seconds ago, my legs refusing to move. The police sirens got louder, winding up the trail toward us. Dean was making these weird gasping sounds, his whole body shaking. I wanted to say something, but my mouth wouldn't work right. My brain kept replaying Mr. Roach's face in that last moment. the sad smile, the way he just stepped back like it was nothing. Two uniformed officers came running up the trail, hands on their belts, looking around for the emergency. I managed to point toward the edge and force words out. "I told them, mister." Roach pushed Dean toward the cliff, then stepped backward and fell. The words sounded fake coming out of my mouth like I was making up a story. One officer went to Dean while the other walked carefully to the edge and looked down, then grabbed his radio. Dean was nodding when they asked if he was hurt, but he couldn't form actual words. The officer kept asking what happened, and Dean just kept nodding and pointing at me. I went through it again, slower this time. Explained about Mr. Roach confessing to killing his son, about positioning Dean at the edge, about the shove. The officer wrote everything down in a little notebook, his pen moving fast across the page. More vehicles arrived within minutes. Paramedics hiked up with their equipment bags and went straight to Dean, checking his arms and legs, shining lights in his eyes. A detective showed up about 20 minutes later, older guy in a rumpled suit who introduced himself as Kenneth Broderick. He listened while I walked him through the whole thing from the beginning, the pattern of hiring young men who looked like Gavin. Finding the obituary, discovering Eagle's Peak had been closed before Gavin died. Breaking into Mr. Roach's office and finding the clean hiking boots, the jacket with old blood, the $2 million life insurance policy. Kenneth wrote all of it down, asking questions about dates and times and specific details. When I got to the confession part, about how Gavin figured out the insurance fraud and Mr. Roach couldn't let the business fail, Kenneth stopped writing and looked at me hard. He asked if I was sure those were Mr. Roach's exact words. I nodded and repeated them as close as I could remember. Dean was sitting on a rock nearby with a blanket around his shoulders, even though it wasn't cold. The paramedics were still checking him over, taking his blood pressure and asking him questions he answered in one-word responses. Kenneth said we both needed to come to the station to give formal statements once the paramedics cleared Dean. My hands started shaking then. Really shaking. Not just trembling, but full-on vibrating. I shoved them in my pockets so Kenneth wouldn't see. The reality hit me that I just watched someone die. Even if I didn't push him, even if he stepped back on his own, I was there and I saw it happen. I was a witness to a death. The paramedics said Dean was physically okay but probably in shock. They wanted to take him to the hospital, but he refused, said he just wanted to get away from this trail. Kenneth told us to follow him down to the station in our own cars. The hike back down felt longer than the hike up. My legs were wobbly and I had to concentrate on each step. Dean walked ahead of me, still wrapped in that blanket, moving like a robot. We got to the parking area where news vans were already setting up. Kenneth told us to ignore them and go straight to our cars. Someone shouted questions about what happened, but Kenneth blocked them while we got to our vehicles. The police station was busy even though it was Saturday afternoon. Kenneth took me to a small interview room with a table and 3 chairs. He said Dean was giving his statement in another room. I spent the next 3 hours going through every single detail. Kenneth wanted to know exactly when I first noticed the pattern of hiring, exactly what I found in Mr. Roach's office, exactly where each item was in the drawer. I admitted I broke into his office and picked the lock on the drawer. Kenneth didn't seem concerned about that, just kept asking more questions about what I saw. I described the hiking boots, how clean they were, too clean for someone who supposedly died hiking. The jacket with the dark stain on the collar that had to be blood. The life insurance policy with Mr. Roach's business listed as beneficiary. Kenneth asked if I took photos and I said no. I heard footsteps and had to hide. He wanted to know who came in, and I explained it was Mr. Roach with Dean, and that's when I really understood what Mr. Roach was planning. The way he watched Dean, it wasn't grief anymore. It was guilt mixed with something desperate. Kenneth leaned back in his chair and said the confession about Gavin's murder changed everything. They would need to exhume the body and reopen that investigation. The original report listed it as an accident, but if Mr. Roach confessed to killing him, they had to treat it as homicide. I felt sick hearing that. Actually sick to my stomach. Gavin was murdered by his own father 4 years ago, and nobody knew. Everyone thought it was a tragic hiking accident. His mother thought her son died doing something he loved. Kenneth said the insurance company would definitely investigate now too, probably try to get their money back. He asked more questions about the other young men Mr. Roach hired over the past 2 years. I gave him Jacob's contact information and said there were at least 5 others I could identify from the office. Kenneth said he'd need to interview all of them about Mr. Roach's behavior. By the time we finished, my throat was dry from talking, and my head hurt from remembering every detail. Kenneth walked me out to the lobby and said I could go home. He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. Dean was already gone, must have finished his statement earlier. I drove home on autopilot, not really seeing the roads or other cars. I got to my apartment at 10 p.m. and just sat in the dark living room. Didn't turn on lights, didn't get food, just sat on the couch staring at nothing. My brain kept replaying the moment Mr. Roach stepped backward, the way his foot left the ground, the way he disappeared over the edge, the sound that came after. I couldn't stop wondering if he meant to do it or if it was an accident. Maybe he was drunk or unstable and lost his balance. Maybe the guilt finally crushed him and he wanted it to end. Maybe confronting him at the cliff pushed him over some edge in his mind before his body went over the real edge. I sat there for hours just replaying it over and over, trying to understand what I saw. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before I was fully awake. Text messages and missed calls from coworkers. I checked my email and saw the company send out a message late Saturday night about a tragic incident involving Mr. Roach, asking everyone to respect the family's privacy. The messages from coworkers were all asking what happened, if I knew anything, if the rumors were true. I didn't respond to any of them except Andre. I texted him asking if he could come over, and he replied immediately that he was on his way. Andre showed up 30 minutes later with coffee and bagels. He took one look at me and didn't ask questions, just handed me the coffee and sat down. I told him everything, start to finish, without stopping. The whole investigation into Mr. Roach's hiring pattern, finding out about Gavin, discovering the lie about Eagle's Peak, breaking into the office and finding the evidence. Dean texting me about the hiking invitation, driving to Miller's Trail and finding them at the cliff edge. The confession, the shove. Mr. Roach stepping backward. Andre listened without interrupting, his coffee getting cold in his hands. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I'd been avoiding since it happened. Did I cause this by confronting Mr. Roach at the cliff? Did showing up there escalate things? Would Mr. Roach still be alive if I'd just let the police handle it? I felt something break inside me and started crying. Actually crying, which I never do. I told Andre I didn't know. I didn't know if showing up saved Dean's life or if it pushed Mr. Roach into doing something he wouldn't have done otherwise. Maybe if I hadn't been there, Mr. Roach would have just talked to Dean and they would have hiked back down. Maybe my presence made everything worse. Andre said that was garbage, that Mr. Roach confessed to murder and was positioning Dean at a cliff edge, that I probably saved Dean's life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I made it worse somehow. Tuesday morning, Kenneth called and asked me to come back to the station. I drove there expecting more questions about the incident. Instead, Kenneth took me to his office and showed me photos on his computer. Crime scene techs had gone through Mr. Roach's office at the company. They found everything exactly where I said it would be. The locked drawer with the hiking gear, the boots that were too clean, the jacket with the blood stain, the life insurance policy listing the business as beneficiary. But they also found something else. A second insurance policy on the business itself, separate from the one on Gavin. Kenneth explained this policy was about to lapse. Mr. Roach had been paying premiums for years but missed the last 2 payments. The policy would have expired in 3 weeks. Kenneth said the business was in financial trouble again, same as it was 4 years ago when Gavin died. Mr. Roach was facing the same situation that made him kill his son, and this time there was no life insurance payout coming to save him. Kenneth pulled up a spreadsheet on his computer showing Mr. Roach's business accounts from 4 years ago. The company had been 3 months away from bankruptcy with creditors threatening lawsuits. Then exactly 2 weeks after Gavin died, $2 million appeared in the business account. Kenneth scrolled through bank statements highlighting the deposit date and the insurance company name. The money went straight to paying off debts, and within a month the business was stable again. I stared at the numbers feeling sick because it proved Mr. Roach had planned everything. He killed his own son to save his company. Kenneth closed the spreadsheet and asked if I had questions. I asked about Dean and how he was handling everything. Kenneth said Dean was staying with his girlfriend Abigail Olieri because he was too shaken to be alone in his apartment. Dean kept asking Kenneth if he could have done something different, if maybe he should have seen the danger coming. Kenneth said Dean blamed himself for not listening to my warning, which made me feel slightly less alone in my guilt. At least we were both struggling with the same what-ifs. Kenneth walked me out and said he'd call if they needed anything else from me. Wednesday morning, I went back to the office for the first time since Saturday. The moment I walked through the door, conversation stopped. People looked at me, then quickly looked away. I went to my desk and tried to focus on work, but kept hearing whispers from nearby cubicles. During my lunch break, I walked past the break room and heard someone say my name. I stopped just outside the door. A woman from accounting was telling 3 other people that I had driven Mr. Roach to suicide by making wild accusations about his dead son. Another voice said I should have minded my own business instead of playing detective. I walked away before they could see me standing there. The rest of the day, people avoided me in hallways and elevators. No one made eye contact. By 3 o'clock, my phone rang with an internal extension I didn't recognize. Lionel Kraft from HR asked me to come to his office right away. I walked down to the 3rd floor where HR was located. Lionel sat behind his desk wearing a concerned expression that looked practiced. He said the company wanted to support me during this difficult time. He suggested I take paid leave for a few weeks while they sorted out the situation. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were cold. I asked what situation needed sorting out. Lionel said the company needed to manage the narrative around Mr. Roach's death and my involvement. He kept using the word optics. I realized this wasn't about supporting me at all. This was about protecting the company from bad publicity. Lionel slid a paper across his desk, outlining the paid leave terms. I pushed the paper back toward him. I told Lionel I was a witness to a crime, not someone who did anything wrong. I had reported concerns to the police and cooperated with their investigation. I wasn't taking leave because that would make it look like I had something to hide. Lionel's friendly expression disappeared. He said the company needed to manage the narrative around what happened. Those exact words again. I asked what narrative they wanted to manage. Lionel said they needed to protect the company's reputation, and having me in the office was making other employees uncomfortable. I stood up and told him I'd be at my desk tomorrow unless he wanted to fire me. He didn't answer, just watched me leave his office. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Roach stepping backward off the cliff. I got up at 2 in the morning and opened my laptop. I searched for information about trauma responses and found articles describing exactly what I was experiencing, replaying the incident over and over, feeling guilty even though logically I knew I hadn't caused it, being extra alert and jumpy at normal sounds. The articles called it acute stress response. One website mentioned that getting help early could prevent it from becoming worse. I found a therapist directory and filtered for people who specialized in traumatic events. A woman named Francine Acker had good reviews and an opening for Thursday morning. I booked the appointment before I could talk myself out of it. Thursday at 9, I sat in Francine's office, a small room with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. She asked me to tell her what happened. I went through the whole story from discovering Mr. Roach's hiring pattern to standing at the cliff edge. Francine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked how I was sleeping and eating. I admitted I wasn't doing much of either. She said my response was normal given what I witnessed. Then she asked if I thought confronting Mr. Roach was wrong. I said I didn't know anymore because maybe if I hadn't shown up, he wouldn't have stepped backward. Francine shook her head. She said, Mr. Roach confessed to murder and was positioning Dean at a cliff edge. My presence likely saved Dean's life. She asked if I could have predicted Mr. Roach would step off the cliff. I admitted no. Francine said I made reasonable decisions based on the evidence I had. I couldn't control what Mr. Roach chose to do in that moment. She asked if I was willing to come back weekly to work through this properly. I said yes. Friday morning, Kenneth called while I was getting ready for work. The medical examiner had finished the autopsy on Mr. Roach. He died from the fall, exactly like it looked. Kenneth said they were treating it as either suicide or an accident that happened during an attempted murder. Either way, I wasn't being investigated for anything. The detective's tone was matter of fact, like he was closing a file. Then Kenneth said something else. They had exhumed Gavin's body earlier that week. The forensic team found evidence that supported Mr. Roach's confession. The head trauma pattern on Gavin's skull matched being struck with something, not from falling and hitting rocks. The angle was wrong for a fall. There were also defensive wounds on Gavin's hands that the original examiner had missed or ignored. Gavin had been murdered exactly like his father admitted. Kenneth said they were officially changing Gavin's death certificate from accident to homicide. I thanked him for the update and sat down on my couch after hanging up. At least Gavin's real cause of death would be on record now. Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Dean. It was the first time he'd contacted me since the cliff. The message asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. He said his girlfriend Abigail thought talking to me might help him process everything, since I was the only other person who heard the confession. I texted back yes, and we agreed to meet Sunday morning at a cafe downtown. Sunday morning, I walked into the small cafe and spotted Dean right away at a corner table. He looked terrible. Dark circles hung under his eyes like bruises, and his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. I sat down across from him and ordered my own drink before either of us said anything. Dean stared at his cup for a long moment before speaking. He told me he'd been having nightmares every single night since the cliff. In the dreams, he sees Mr. Roach's face right before he stepped backward. Sometimes the confession plays on repeat in his head until he wakes up at 3 in the morning covered in sweat. I watched him rub his eyes and noticed how much weight he'd lost in just over a week. The cafe buzzed with Sunday morning conversations around us, but our table felt separate and quiet. I told Dean I'd started seeing a therapist named Francine, and it was helping me process everything. He should consider doing the same thing. Dean nodded slowly and admitted Abigail had already found someone for him to call, but he'd been putting off making the appointment because he was scared. Making the appointment meant talking about what happened, and talking about it made everything feel more real. His voice cracked slightly on the word real, and he looked away toward the window. I understood that fear completely because I'd felt the same way before calling Francine. Dean suddenly turned back to me and asked a question I wasn't expecting. Did I think Mr. Roach actually meant to kill him, or was he just trying to scare him? I took a breath before answering because I wanted to be honest. Based on the confession about Gavin and how Mr. Roach positioned Dean at the cliff edge, I thought he was working up to pushing him. The shove toward the edge wasn't accidental or just for show. Dean's face went pale when I said that, and he gripped his coffee cup tighter. We sat in silence for what felt like a long time. Other people laughed and talked around us, but neither of us moved or spoke. Finally, Dean looked at me and quietly thanked me for showing up at the trail that day. He admitted he thought I was being paranoid when I warned him not to go hiking. He was sorry he didn't listen to me, and sorry he laughed off my concerns. If I hadn't followed them to Miller's Trail, he doesn't know what would have happened. I told him he didn't need to apologize, but he shook his head and said he did. We finished our coffee and Dean promised he'd call the therapist Abigail found. The following week, Kenneth called me while I was at my desk trying to focus on work. They'd finished searching Mr. Roach's home and found journals hidden in his bedroom closet. Dozens of notebooks dating back 4 years. Kenneth's voice sounded tired as he explained what the entries contained. Detailed accounts of Mr. Roach's guilt about killing Gavin. Pages and pages about the young men he hired and why each one disappointed him. He'd been trying to recreate his son and find some kind of forgiveness that would never come. The journals confirmed everything I'd suspected about the pattern and the obsession. Kenneth said he'd email me copies of relevant pages for my records as a witness. When the email arrived that afternoon, I made myself read through the attached scans. Mr. Roach's handwriting got messier and more frantic as the entries progressed over the years. But the worst part came in the final notebook from the weeks before the cliff incident. The journals revealed Mr. Roach had been planning to stage Dean's death as a hiking accident, exactly like he did with Gavin. He'd written out the steps and the timeline, how he'd position Dean at the edge, how he'd make it look like a tragic fall. Reading those details made me physically ill, and I had to close my laptop and walk to the bathroom. But seeing it written out also validated that my intervention was necessary. Dean would be dead right now if I hadn't shown up. 2 days later, Lionel called me back to HR for another meeting. When I arrived, Fletcher Hubbard was sitting next to him. Fletcher introduced himself as the company attorney and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. They slid a document across the table toward me. Lionel explained they wanted me to sign an NDA about the incident in exchange for a severance package. He called it standard procedure for traumatic workplace events and kept his voice calm and professional. I picked up the document and started reading through it. The language was dense and full of legal terms, but the intent was clear. They wanted my silence. I put the papers down and told them I wouldn't sign anything without reading it carefully first. I also reminded them I was a witness in an active criminal investigation. Fletcher's expression shifted from friendly to cold in an instant. He leaned forward slightly and said that continued employment at the company requires discretion. The way he emphasized the word discretion made it sound like a threat. I picked up the unsigned NDA and told them I'd have my own lawyer review it before making any decisions. That night I called a lawyer my cousin had recommended months ago for an unrelated issue. She agreed to look over the NDA and called me back within 2 hours. Her assessment was blunt and concerning. The document was designed to prevent me from talking about Mr. Roach's crimes and the company's potential negligence. They'd failed to notice the obvious pattern of hiring young men who looked identical, failed to investigate when previous hires complained about harassment. The NDA would protect the company from liability while silencing me completely. She advised me not to sign it as written. At my next therapy session with Francine, I told her about the pressure from work, the hostile looks from coworkers, the NDA attempt, the guilt that still crept up about Mr. Roach's death, even though I knew intervention was right. Francine listened carefully and then introduced me to a concept I'd never heard before: moral injury. She explained it as psychological distress that comes from witnessing or participating in events that go against your core values. It's different from regular trauma because it involves a violation of what you believe is right. Watching someone die even when they were dangerous and guilty creates moral injury. Being pressured to stay silent about crimes creates moral injury. Francine said recognizing this type of harm was the first step toward processing it properly. I spent the rest of that session working through the guilt with Francine, and something clicked when she asked me to identify exactly what I felt guilty about. I realized it wasn't really about causing Mr. Roach's death. That part felt almost like watching something inevitable happen, like he'd been heading toward that cliff edge for 4 years. What actually made me feel guilty was the relief. The immediate, overwhelming relief that he was gone and couldn't hurt Dean or any future hire who looked like Gavin. Francine leaned forward and told me that relief didn't make me a bad person. It made me human. She explained that I could feel multiple things at once without any of them canceling out the others. Relief that Dean was safe, sadness that Mr. Roach couldn't get help, horror at witnessing a death. All of those existed together and none of them were wrong. I left that session feeling lighter than I had in days, like someone had given me permission to stop punishing myself for having normal reactions to an abnormal situation. 3 days later, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant and familiar. Jakob introduced himself and asked if I remembered him from the office. My stomach tightened because I hadn't thought about Jacob in weeks, not since I'd connected his harassment story to Mr. Roach's pattern. He told me he'd seen news coverage about Mr. Roach's death and the investigation into Gavin's murder. The articles mentioned that police were looking into Mr. Roach's behavior with previous employees. Jacob wanted to know if the police needed his statement about what happened during his 3 months at the company. He said he was willing to help if it mattered, if his experience could add anything useful to understanding what Mr. Roach had been doing. I told him it absolutely mattered, and that Detective Kenneth was building a complete picture of Mr. Roach's behavior pattern. Jacob sounded relieved when I said I'd connect them. He admitted he'd been having nightmares again after seeing the news, reliving that midnight knock on his apartment door and Mr. Roach calling him Gavin while drunk and crying. Talking to the police might help him process it properly, instead of just trying to forget it happened. I called Kenneth that same afternoon and explained that Jacob had reached out. The detective asked me to have Jacob contact him directly and gave me his number to pass along. I texted Jacob the information, and he responded within minutes saying he'd call Kenneth tomorrow. 2 days later, Kenneth contacted me with an update. Jacob's testimony had been incredibly helpful in establishing Mr. Roach's deteriorating mental state over time. The midnight visit where Mr. Roach called Jacob by Gavin's name and asked for forgiveness added crucial context about how obsessed he'd become. Jacob also provided details about the phone calls and gym appearances that showed a clear pattern of escalating harassment. Kenneth explained that this testimony helped demonstrate that Mr. Roach's behavior wasn't just grief, but something darker and more dangerous. It showed premeditation in how he was selected and pursued these young men, always looking for the one who might somehow replace or forgive what he'd done to his actual son. The detective thanked me for connecting them and said Jacob's statement would be part of the official case file. 2 weeks after the Cliff incident, I got a call from prosecutor Griffin Kent. He introduced himself and explained he was handling the criminal case related to Gavin Roach's death. Even though Mr. Roach was dead and couldn't be prosecuted, Griffin said they wanted to officially close Gavin's case as a homicide rather than leaving it classified as an accident. The confession I'd witnessed at the Cliff, combined with the physical evidence from Mr. Roach's office and the exhumation results, gave them everything they needed to make that determination. Griffin asked if I'd be willing to provide a formal statement about what Mr. Roach said before he fell. I agreed immediately, and he scheduled me to come to his office the following week. He warned me that the statement would be detailed and might take several hours because they needed to document every word of the confession I'd heard. I told him I understood and that I wanted to help however I could. Griffin's voice was kind but professional when he thanked me and said this case mattered more than most people might realize. At the prosecutor's office, Griffin walked me through why clearing Gavin's name was so important. He explained that Gavin's mother deserved to know her son didn't die from reckless hiking or poor judgment. Gavin had been murdered by his own father, and that truth needed to be officially recognized. The mother had spent 4 years blaming herself for not teaching Gavin better trail safety, for not insisting he wait for better weather, for not going with him that day. Griffin said she needed to know that nothing she could have done would have prevented what happened because it wasn't an accident at all. He also mentioned that the insurance company was investigating whether they could recover the fraudulent $2 million payout. Mr. Roach had committed insurance fraud on top of murder, and the company wanted to pursue recovering those funds. Any money they got back would likely go to Gavin's mother as part of a settlement. Griffin spent 3 hours taking my statement, asking me to repeat exact phrases from Mr. Roach's confession multiple times to make sure the record was accurate. By the end, I felt drained, but also like I'd done something meaningful for Gavin and his mother. Back at work, the atmosphere hadn't improved at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The whispers followed me everywhere now. I'd walk into the break room and conversations would stop mid-sentence. People would grab their coffee and leave rather than stand near me. At lunch, I sat alone at a table in the corner while clusters of coworkers gathered at other tables, occasionally glancing my way and talking quietly. Andre stayed loyal and joined me most days, but I could tell even he was feeling the pressure. Other coworkers clearly blamed me for Mr. Roach's death and the company's damaged reputation. News coverage had mentioned the company name, and apparently some clients had started asking questions about what kind of workplace allowed this situation to develop. The CEO had sent out a carefully worded email about tragedy and moving forward, but it didn't help the daily reality of being treated like I'd personally destroyed everyone's job security. I started eating lunch at my desk, just to avoid the hostile stares and uncomfortable silence that followed me into shared spaces. Lionel pulled me aside one afternoon, and this time he dropped the friendly HR representative act completely. We stood in a quiet hallway near the bathrooms, and his expression was cold and businesslike. He told me that my continued presence was disruptive to workplace morale. He said other employees were uncomfortable, and productivity had declined since the incident. The company had been generous in offering severance and an NDA, and he strongly suggested I accept it for everyone's benefit. The way he emphasized strongly suggested made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion anymore. Lionel added that the company was prepared to make things difficult if I chose to stay and fight. He didn't specify what that meant, but the threat was obvious in his tone. I told him I'd think about it and walked away before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I returned to my desk. I'd known the pressure was building, but having Lionel drop the pretense and essentially tell me to leave or face consequences felt like a punch to the gut. I called my lawyer that evening and explained what Lionel had said. She listened carefully and then gave me her honest assessment. Fighting the company would be exhausting and expensive. They had resources I didn't have, and they could drag things out indefinitely if they wanted to make my life miserable. However, she said she could negotiate better terms than what they'd initially offered. A larger severance package that would cover more than the original 3 months. An NDA that didn't prevent me from cooperating with law enforcement or talking to Kenneth and Griffin about the criminal case. She could also negotiate a neutral reference agreement so the company couldn't badmouth me to future employers. My lawyer recommended taking the improved deal if she could get it. She pointed out that staying at a workplace where I was actively unwanted would damage my mental health and career prospects more than leaving with a solid severance would. I told her to start negotiating and see what terms she could get. Part of me felt like I was giving up, but another part knew she was right about the toll this daily hostility was taking. At my next session with Francine, I told her about Lionel's ultimatum and my lawyer's advice. Francine asked me a question I'd been avoiding asking myself. What was I fighting for? Was it principle or practicality? And more importantly, could this workplace ever feel safe again? I sat with those questions for a long moment before admitting that I didn't think the office could ever feel safe. Too many people there saw me as the problem instead of recognizing that I'd helped prevent another murder. Even if I stayed and won some moral victory, I'd be walking into a hostile environment every single day. Francine pointed out that sometimes the healthiest choice isn't the one that feels like winning. Sometimes it's the choice that protects your well-being and lets you move forward instead of staying stuck in a toxic situation. She asked me to think about what I wanted my life to look like 6 months from now. Did I want to still be fighting this company and dealing with hostile coworkers, or did I want to be somewhere new where people didn't know anything about Mr. Roach or the cliff or any of it? That question helped clarify things in a way nothing else had. 2 days later, my phone rang with Dean's number. I picked up immediately, worried something had happened. But Dean's voice sounded better than it had since the incident. He told me he'd started therapy and it was actually helping. His therapist was teaching him techniques for managing the nightmares and processing the trauma of what happened at the cliff. Dean said he'd made a decision. He was leaving the company too. Being in that office reminded him too much of Mr. Roach's attention and the whole nightmare. Every time he walked past Mr. Roach's old office or sat at his desk where Mr. Roach used to stop by constantly, he felt sick. His girlfriend Abigail had been supportive about the decision, and he'd already started looking at job openings in different industries. Hearing Dean's decision somehow made my own choice feel more clear. We'd both survived something terrible, and neither of us needed to keep punishing ourselves by staying in a place that would never let us forget it. I hung up with Dean and sat there thinking about what he'd said. He was leaving because staying hurt too much and nobody could blame him for that. I realized I was doing the same math in my head about my own situation. Staying at that office meant walking past hostile coworkers every single day, people who thought I'd driven Mr. Roach to his death instead of stopping him from killing Dean. My lawyer was right about the toll it was taking. I wasn't running away by leaving. I was choosing to protect my mental health over a workplace that cared more about reputation than supporting someone who'd witnessed a crime. The decision felt clear for the first time since this whole thing started. The next morning, I called Lionel and told him I'd consider the severance package if they made 2 changes. First, remove the clause that prevented me from cooperating with law enforcement. Second, increase the amount to cover 6 months of living expenses, not 3. He went quiet for a long moment before saying he'd need to discuss it with Fletcher and get back to me. My lawyer had coached me on this conversation, telling me to stay calm and firm. Companies usually caved when they realized you had legal representation and weren't going to just disappear quietly. 2 hours later, Lionel called back and asked me to come in for a meeting that afternoon. I brought my lawyer with me this time. Fletcher was already in the conference room when we arrived, looking less friendly than during our first conversation. He started by saying the company's original offer was generous, and they didn't typically negotiate severance terms. My lawyer cut him off and laid out exactly why their NDA was problematic, using words like legal exposure and witness intimidation that made Fletcher's jaw tighten. She pointed out that I was cooperating with an active homicide investigation, and any attempt to silence me could be seen as obstruction. The room got very quiet after that. Fletcher excused himself to make a phone call, and when he came back 20 minutes later, his whole attitude had changed. He said they'd agree to remove the law enforcement clause and increase the severance to 5 months instead of 6. My lawyer started to argue, but I touched her arm. 5 months was enough. I told them I'd accept those terms if they put it in writing by the end of the week. The paperwork arrived on Friday afternoon. I read through every page twice, making sure the language matched what we'd agreed to. The NDA only covered internal company information and specifically excluded anything related to criminal investigations or legal proceedings. The severance amount would cover 5 months of rent and expenses, giving me breathing room to recover before job hunting. I signed it and sent it back. My last day would be 4 weeks from now, at the end of the month. Part of me felt relieved and part of me felt like I was giving up, but mostly I just felt tired. I'd been carrying the weight of that cliff and Mr. Roach's confession for weeks now, and the idea of not walking into that hostile office anymore sounded like freedom. Kenneth called the following Tuesday with an update about the investigation. The insurance company that paid out Gavin's $2 million policy was pursuing civil action against Mr. Roach's estate. They wanted to recover the fraudulent payout since the death was actually murder, not an accident. Kenneth said the money would probably end up going to Gavin's mother and the business creditors Mr. Roach had been trying to avoid when he killed his son. I asked how long that process would take, and Kenneth laughed without humor. He said civil cases moved slowly, probably a year or more before everything was settled. At least Gavin's mom would get something out of this nightmare. Kenneth also mentioned they'd finished interviewing all the previous hires who looked like Gavin. Most of them had similar stories to Jacob about Mr. Roach's intense attention and uncomfortable behavior. It painted a clear picture of a man spiraling deeper into guilt and obsession over 4 years. 3 days later, Griffin called with different news. He said they were officially closing Gavin's case as a homicide rather than an accidental death. The evidence was overwhelming once they put all the pieces together. Mr. Roach's confession, the insurance fraud, the head trauma that didn't match a fall, all of it pointed to murder. Griffin said the prosecutor's office was releasing a statement to the press about it. I asked if my name would be mentioned, and he assured me it wouldn't. I was listed in the reports as a witness, but the media wouldn't get those details. That afternoon, I saw the news story online. The headline read, "Father killed son for insurance money, hired lookalikes for years." Reading it in black and white like that, seeing it presented as established fact rather than my personal nightmare, made the whole thing feel more real somehow. The article mentioned Mr. Roach's death at Miller's Trail and noted that he'd been attempting to harm another employee when he fell. It quoted Griffin saying justice had been delayed, but the truth was finally known. The comment section was full of people calling Mr. Roach a monster and expressing sympathy for Gavin. Nobody knew I existed, which was exactly how I wanted it. My last day at the office arrived faster than I expected. I came in early to pack my desk before everyone else showed up. Andre met me there with coffee and boxes, helping me sort through 4 years of accumulated stuff. Photos, coffee mugs, the little plant that somehow survived on my desk despite minimal care. Most of it went in the trash. I didn't want reminders of this place. A few coworkers stopped by as the morning went on, mumbling awkward goodbyes and good luck wishes. Most people just pretended I wasn't there, walking past my cubicle without making eye contact. Andre helped me carry the boxes to my car at lunch and made me promise to stay in touch. He said he was job hunting too, that the office had never recovered from everything that happened. We hugged in the parking lot, and I drove away without looking back at the building. The first week of unemployment felt strange in ways I hadn't expected. I slept better without the daily stress of hostile coworkers and whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. My shoulders didn't hurt as much from constant tension, but I also felt unmoored without the routine and structure that work provided. I'd wake up at my usual time and then remember I had nowhere to go. The apartment felt too quiet during the day. I started sleeping later, staying up later, losing track of what day it was. By Friday, I realized I'd barely left the apartment all week except for groceries. That probably wasn't healthy. At my next session with Francine, I told her about the weird, empty feeling. She said it was completely normal to feel lost after leaving a job, even a toxic one. Work provides structure and purpose whether we like it or not. She suggested we work on rebuilding that structure in healthier ways. We made a plan together. Exercise every morning, even just a walk around the block. Dedicated job searching time in the afternoons. Social time with Andre or other friends at least twice a week. Continue therapy every week. Francine emphasized that healing wasn't linear, and some days would be harder than others. She said the goal wasn't to feel perfect, just to keep moving forward bit by bit. I left her office feeling like I had a roadmap instead of just drifting. Dean texted me 2 weeks into my unemployment, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. I said yes immediately. We met at the same quiet cafe as before, but this time Dean looked significantly better. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and he smiled when he saw me. He told me he'd started a new job in a completely different industry, working for a small marketing firm. The pay was similar, but the environment felt healthier. Nobody there knew anything about Mr. Roach or the cliff or any of it. Dean said the distance from everything connected to that nightmare had helped tremendously. He was still doing therapy, and the nightmares had decreased to maybe once a week instead of every night. Abigail had been amazing through everything, he said, really supporting him when things got dark. I told him about my own job search and therapy, and we compared notes on what was helping. It felt good to talk to someone who understood exactly what I'd been through. The next day, I got an email from Jakob. He said Kenneth had contacted him about giving a statement for the investigation, and he wanted to thank me for connecting them. Jacob wrote that talking to the detective and explaining what Mr. Roach had put him through actually helped him process the whole experience. He'd felt so alone and confused when it was happening, wondering if he was overreacting to Mr. Roach's behavior. Learning that 6 other guys had gone through similar things, that there was a pattern and a reason behind it, made him feel less crazy. Jacob said giving his statement helped him feel less alone in the experience of Mr. Roach's obsessive behavior. He was doing better now, working at a different company, and seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of those 3 months. He ended the email by saying he hoped I was taking care of myself too. I replied thanking him and closed the email. 2 months had passed since that day at the cliff. 2 months of therapy sessions and nightmares and replaying every moment in my head, wondering if I could have done something different. But last night, something changed. I slept through the entire night without jerking awake to the image of Mr. Roach stepping backward. Without hearing that sound from the bottom of the cliff, I woke up naturally at 7 in the morning feeling rested for the first time since the incident. At my Thursday session with Francine, I mentioned the full night of sleep almost hesitantly, like saying it out loud might jinx it. She smiled and made a note in her file. She said trauma recovery happens in small steps like this, not giant breakthroughs. The nightmares might come back occasionally, but each good night was progress. She reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line upward. Some weeks would be harder than others, but the fact that my brain was finally letting me rest meant something important was shifting. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The job applications I'd been sending out started getting responses. My inbox filled with interview requests from companies in different industries, different sizes, different parts of the city. During the first interview, the hiring manager asked why I was leaving my current position. I'd practiced this answer with Francine. I explained there had been a traumatic workplace incident that made it impossible to continue there, but I couldn't share details due to the ongoing investigation. The manager nodded and moved on to questions about my actual work experience. No judgment, no prying. The second interview went similarly, and the third. Most people seem to understand that sometimes you need to leave a job for reasons beyond your control. They focused on my skills and experience instead of dwelling on why I was available. By the end of the second week, I had 3 companies interested in second interviews. The job search was actually going somewhere. My phone buzzed during lunch on a Wednesday. Email from Griffin Kent, the prosecutor. I opened it immediately. The civil case against Mr. Roach's estate had settled. The insurance company recovered most of the $2 million payout that Mr. Roach had fraudulently collected after murdering Gavin. After legal fees and other claims, a significant portion went to Gavin's mother. Griffin included a link to a statement she'd released through her lawyer. I clicked it with shaking hands. The statement was brief, but powerful. She thanked everyone who had helped uncover the truth about her son's death. She said the money didn't matter compared to finally knowing what really happened. She'd spent 4 years thinking Gavin died because he'd been careless on a hike, blaming herself for not teaching him better trail safety. Learning that he'd been murdered, that his death wasn't a preventable accident, changed everything. The guilt she'd carried for 4 years wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to the man who killed him. I read her statement 3 times sitting at my kitchen table. Something I'd been holding onto for months started to loosen in my chest. Gavin's mother had closure now, not the kind anyone wants, not the kind that makes the pain go away. But she knew the truth. She knew her son hadn't died from a mistake. She knew he'd figured out his father's plan and tried to do the right thing. That knowledge, as painful as it was, mattered more to her than believing he'd died from carelessness. I saved the statement to my phone. Somehow reading her words helped me believe that what I'd done, showing up at that trail and confronting Mr. Roach, had been worth the cost. Dean was alive. The truth about Gavin came out. Sometimes that had to be enough. The third interview turned into a job offer on Friday morning. A smaller company in a completely different industry than my previous work. They designed educational software for schools, nothing like the corporate environment I'd left. The pay was almost identical to what I'd been making. The benefits were actually better. During the office tour, I'd noticed people chatting casually in the break room, laughing at someone's story. The management team had been transparent about expectations and company culture. Nobody seemed stressed or scared. No weird undercurrents or unspoken rules. Most importantly, nobody there knew anything about Mr. Roach or the cliff or any of it. I could start fresh. I called them back Monday morning and accepted the position. My start date was 3 weeks away. Francine noticed the change in me immediately at our next session. She said I was smiling more, my shoulders weren't up around my ears anymore, and I'd stopped scanning the room when I entered like I was checking for threats. The constant alertness that had become my normal state was fading. We talked about transitioning to sessions every 2 weeks instead of weekly. She wanted to make sure I felt stable enough for that adjustment. I admitted I was nervous about reducing therapy, worried I might backslide without the weekly check-ins. But she reminded me that I'd built good coping skills and knew how to reach out if things got harder. The goal wasn't to stay in therapy forever. It was to get to a place where I could manage without needing that weekly support. We agreed to try bi-weekly sessions and see how it went. My phone lit up with a text from Dean on a Tuesday evening. The message was short, but made me actually laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. He and Abigail had gotten engaged over the weekend. He'd proposed at the park where they had their first date, nothing fancy, just the 2 of them. He wrote that going through the trauma together had shown him what mattered most. Being with someone who supports you through the absolute worst moments and helps you rebuild afterward. Building a life focused on real connection, instead of just going through the motions. He said he never thought something so horrible could lead to something so good, but here he was planning a wedding. I texted back congratulations and told him I was genuinely happy for them both. And I meant it. Dean had survived something that could have destroyed him, and he was choosing to move forward towards something positive. My first day at the new job felt surreal. The office was smaller, brighter, with windows that actually let in natural light. My new coworkers introduced themselves and seemed genuinely friendly, not the forced corporate friendliness I was used to. Nobody asked probing questions about where I'd worked before. During the team meeting, the department head explained projects clearly and asked for input from everyone, actually listening to the responses. There was no tension in the room, no sense that people were afraid to speak up. I could focus on learning the new systems and understanding my role without constantly looking over my shoulder, without wondering what secret crisis was brewing beneath the surface. The difference was so obvious it almost made me angry about how toxic my previous workplace had been. But mostly I just felt relieved. This was what a normal job environment was supposed to feel like. Andre texted asking if I wanted to meet for drinks after work. We hadn't seen each other in almost 3 months, just occasional text updates. We met at the bar near his apartment and he looked tired but okay. He filled me in on the old office. The company had hired new leadership after everything came out about Mr. Roach. They'd implemented better oversight policies and mandatory training about recognizing warning signs of workplace problems. But Andre said the culture never fully recovered. Too many people remembered what happened, and there was still this underlying discomfort. He was actively job hunting because even with the improvements, being there reminded him of everything. I understood completely. Some environments can't be fixed no matter how many policies you implement. We spent the rest of the evening talking about normal things, his upcoming vacation, a movie he'd seen, my new coworkers. It felt good to have a conversation that wasn't centered on trauma. I realized something on my drive home that night. I was genuinely okay. Not perfect, not completely healed, but okay. I still thought about that day at the cliff sometimes. The image of Mr. Roach stepping backward would probably never fully leave me, but it didn't consume me anymore. It didn't dominate every waking thought and invade every dream. I'd seen something deeply wrong and I'd spoken up about it. I'd cooperated with Kenneth and Griffin and everyone investigating. I'd protected Dean even though it cost me professionally and put me through months of trauma. And in the end, Gavin's mother got the truth. Dean was safe. The pattern of hiring vulnerable young men stopped. That was enough. It had to be enough. I couldn't undo what happened or change the choices Mr. Roach made, but I'd done what I could with the information I had. That realization settled over me like a weightlifting. I turned up the radio and drove home to my quiet apartment, ready for whatever came next. That's all I've got. If you're still watching, I'm impressed and mildly concerned. But hey, you might as well subscribe at this point. It can't get much worse, right?